In the summer of 1886, a British surveyor named Edward Grimshaw was found dead in his quarters at the Sibby railway camp, his skull crushed by a single heavy blow. The official report called it a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence by unknown tribesmen. But there was one detail the report never mentioned: the object clenched in Grimshaw's hand, hidden beneath his body, was a small clay seal bearing a symbol that should not have existed in Balochistan in the 19th century. The Bolan Pass is a wound in the earth, a jagged gorge that cuts through the Suleiman Mountains, connecting the plains of Sindh to the high plateau of Balochistan. For centuries, it was the gateway to Afghanistan, a narrow corridor through which armies had marched, caravans had passed, and empires had risen and fallen. By the 1880s, the British Raj had decided to conquer this pass, not with soldiers, but with steel and steam. They were building a railway through the Bolan, an engineering marvel that would link British India to the strategic outpost of Quetta and, beyond it, the fearsome approaches to Afghanistan itself. But the Bolan had secrets that no railway survey had mapped, and the railway builders were about to stumble into a mystery that would claim lives, destroy reputations, and vanish from the official record for over a century. This is the story of the Bolan Pass incident. It begins with a discovery in a Delhi archive, 137 years later. And it ends with a question that still has no answer. In April 2022, archivists at the National Railway Museum in New Delhi were conducting a routine inventory of a collection of 19th-century photographs when they found a set of 18 images that did not match any of their catalogue locations. The photographs showed tall bridges cutting across rocky, hilly terrain, tunnels with arched entrances, and laborers toiling on a construction site. One of the tunnels was clearly labeled with the name, Mary Jane, 1894. Another bore the inscription Pir Panjay. Yet another, Mushkaf. The archivists ran multiple searches, trying to locate these tunnels in India's present-day boundaries. They failed. The tunnels simply did not exist within modern India. The photographs, however, were unmistakably real. They showed a railway line of astonishing ambition, built through impossible mountain terrain. Somewhere in the archives, the archivists realized, there must be records that explained what this forgotten railway was and where it had been built. What they found would open a door onto one of the most audacious construction projects of the 19th century and one of its most disturbing mysteries. The story, as it emerged, began with the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878 to 1880. Britain's military planners had faced a nightmare. Supplying tens of thousands of troops in Afghanistan required a supply chain that stretched hundreds of miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The solution was a railway, a line that would follow the ancient trade route through the Bolan Pass. Survey parties were dispatched in the late 1870s, and by 1880, construction had begun on a railway that would run from Sibby to Quetta, an 89-mile journey through the Bolan Gorge. The railway's chief engineer was a man named Thomas Edward Hunt, a veteran of mountain railway construction in the Himalayas. Hunt was a meticulous man, known for keeping journals that recorded every detail of his projects. His reports, preserved in the archives of the Northwestern Railway, describe in clinical detail the scale of the challenge, the sheer cliffs, the precarious ledges, the constant threat of flash floods and rockfalls. The laborers were a mixture of Punjabis, Hazaras, Afghans, and Baloch. They worked in conditions of appalling danger, suspended on ropes above the gorge, carving tunnels through solid rock with pick and shovel. There was no dynamite in the early years. Instead, the workers used slow-burning fuses and gunpowder, a painstaking method that took months to dig a single tunnel. The conditions were brutal, the pay was meager, and the death toll was high. But the work continued, driven by the strategic imperative of connecting India to Afghanistan. It was Edward Grimshaw who first noticed something was wrong. Grimshaw was Hunt's deputy, a practical engineer who had come to India in 1878 and had already built bridges in the Punjab. He was a blunt man, given to frank opinions that occasionally irritated his superiors. In his personal notes, now lost to history but referenced in scattered reports, Grimshaw wrote about the peculiar behavior of the local Baloch laborers. They were terrified of certain sections of the pass, not of the working conditions, but of something else. At night, Grimshaw observed, some of the men performed rituals before prayer, offerings to spirits that the British engineers dismissed as primitive superstition. But Grimshaw, unlike his superiors, paid attention. In the late autumn of 1885, Grimshaw was mapping a particularly difficult section of the route, an area known locally as the Place of the Hidden Stones. The name referred to a legend among the Baloch tribes about a settlement that had existed in the past long before the British arrived, a city so ancient that even the local elders could not remember its name. The legend told of a great flood that had swept through the gorge, burying the city under mud and rock, and the spirits of its inhabitants had remained ever since, guarding its remains from the living. Grimshaw was not a superstitious man, but he was a meticulous one. And when he heard the laborers whispering about the hidden stones, he made a note to investigate. What he found, according to a fragment of his journal that survived in the archive, was a series of stone blocks, carved with symbols that were unlike any he had seen. The blocks were not Baloch, he wrote. They were not even Indian. He suspected they were remnants of the armies of Alexander the Great, whose forces were known to have passed through the Bolan in 326 BCE. He was wrong. But by the time that became clear, it was far too late. In 1886, Edward Grimshaw's body was found in his quarters at the Sibby camp. The official investigation concluded that he had been killed by unknown assailants, motivated by robbery. The case was closed within a week. But there were whispers. Some of the laborers had seen a strange figure around the camp in the days before Grimshaw died, a tall man in Afghan clothing who had asked about the engineer's survey maps. No one could describe the figure's face. No one could explain what he had wanted. And no one could explain why Grimshaw's hands were covered in clay when his body was discovered. Thomas Hunt, Grimshaw's superior, took over the survey work. But he faced a new problem. The laborers, particularly the Baloch, had begun to leave. They said that the spirits of the past were angry, that the railway was disturbing the sleep of the buried city, and that anyone who worked in its shadow would die. Hunt dismissed these claims as superstition and ordered the foreman to find replacements. He had a railway to build and a deadline to meet. But even Hunt, a man who prided himself on his rationality, recorded a strange unease in his official reports. In one letter to his superiors in Lahore, dated February 1887, he wrote, "The natives continue to display a remarkable reluctance to work in the vicinity of the pass. I have offered increased wages, to no avail. There is something in this place that unsettles them deeply. I am not given to fancies, but I confess that I share some of their disquiet. The pass has an atmosphere of oppression that I find difficult to describe." The letter was dismissed by his superiors as a momentary lapse of nerve. Hunt himself later distanced himself from it, insisting that he had been tired and overwrought. The railway opened in 1889, a triumph of engineering that allowed British troops to be moved from India to Afghanistan in record time. The line through the Bolan Pass became a vital strategic asset, used continuously until the partition of India in 1947, when it passed into the control of Pakistan Railways. For the next half-century, the Bolan Pass Railway was simply a railway, a vital connection, a marvel of construction, a symbol of British imperial power. The story of the hidden stones, of the troubled workers and the murdered engineer, faded from memory. The official records mentioned nothing. The mystery was buried, almost as completely as the legendary city that had supposedly been buried in the past centuries before. That should have been the end of it. But the discovery of the photographs in the Delhi archive in 2022 changed everything. The photographs themselves, taken between 1890 and 1895, show a railway still under construction, despite its official opening the year before. The images of the Mushkaf-Bolan line were accompanied in the archives by a research paper written by a British rail engineer, James Ramsay, titled The Mushkaf-Bolan Railway, Baluchistan, India. The paper described in detail the hardships of construction and the engineering solutions that had been devised to overcome the pass's deadly terrain. But it also made mention of something else, a reference that caught the attention of the archivists, a collection of artifacts of unknown origin found during excavations near one of the tunnels. The artifacts, the paper noted, had been sent to the British Museum in London for identification. No record of their arrival at the museum appears to exist. They disappeared, leaving only a single line in a forgotten research paper as evidence of their existence. What were those artifacts? The archivists in Delhi began to dig deeper, searching through the archives of the Northwestern Railway for any correspondence that might shed light on the mysterious objects. They found a telegram, dated August 1893, from the engineer in charge of the Bolan section to the chief engineer in Lahore. It read, "Found structures of ancient origin at tunnel site. Permission requested to suspend work until expert examination completed." The reply from Lahore, sent 2 weeks later, was terse: "Proceed with construction. Do not delay. Artifacts to be removed and sent to museum." The last line of the telegram was particularly significant: "This matter to be treated with the utmost discretion." The structures mentioned in the telegram were not described. But the archivists, now driven by curiosity, cross-referenced the telegram with other documents from the period. They found a letter, written in 1894, from a civil servant in the Punjab government to the Foreign Department of the Government of India. The letter concerned the activities of a government surveyor who had been working in the Bolan Pass in 1885, a surveyor named Edward Grimshaw. The letter noted that Grimshaw had sent a parcel to the Foreign Department shortly before his death, a parcel that he had described as of great importance for the history of the region. The parcel had been received, but its contents were not recorded. The letter was the first official acknowledgement, in any surviving document, that Grimshaw had sent something of value to the government in the weeks before he was killed. That parcel, like the artifacts and the research paper, had vanished from the historical record. If Grimshaw's parcel, the structures found at the tunnel site, and the artifacts sent to London had all disappeared, the archivists realized, then someone in the government of British India had had an interest in making the past, or at least a specific part of it, disappear. The only question was what it had been. The answer, when it began to emerge, was far stranger than anyone had expected. The key was a little-known archaeological survey conducted in Balochistan in 1882, 3 years before Grimshaw's death. The survey was led by a British officer, Major William Sutherland, who had been tasked with evaluating the archaeological sites of the region. Sutherland's report was buried in the archives of the Archaeological Survey of India, a dense bureaucratic document that had not been touched for over a century. But when the archivists finally located it, they found something that made them stop. In a footnote to the report, Sutherland mentioned structures in the Bolan Pass that appear to predate the arrival of Islam in the region. He did not elaborate. But he included a sketch of a carved stone block, a block bearing symbols that looked nothing like the Baloch tribal marks, nothing like the Perso-Arabic script that had dominated the region since the 7th century, and nothing like anything else the archivists had ever seen. The symbols resembled a script. But it was a script that was utterly unknown, with no connections to Sanskrit, to Avestan, to ancient Persian, or to any known system of writing. It was, as one of the archivists later put it, the written equivalent of a gap in the historical record, a page that had been torn out of the book of human civilization. How had a script of this nature come to exist in Balochistan? No historical account of the region mentions such a script. No traveler, no explorer, no soldier had ever described it. And yet the evidence of its existence was there, buried in a dusty archive, in a footnote to a report that had been written 140 years ago. The search for answers led the archivists to a story that was entirely absent from any official history of the Bolan Pass. The region, it appears, had a deep history that was rooted not in the Islamic era, not in the invasions of Alexander or the armies of Genghis Khan, but in a period of antiquity that had been all but forgotten. The Baloch legends of a city buried by a flood were not, it seems, merely folklore. They were a memory, a fragment of oral tradition that had survived for millennia, passed down through generations, distorted by time but still carrying a kernel of truth. There were, the archivists discovered, other fragments of this memory scattered across the region. An inscription found by a British doctor in the hills above Quetta in 1878, dismissed as a forgery at the time. A collection of pottery shards in the private collection of an Indian Army officer, sold to a museum in Lahore after his death and then lost to the chaos of the 1947 partition. A reference in a 19th-century Persian chronicle, quoting a much older work, to the city of the writing on the stones. And then there was the Bolan Pass Railway itself. The railway builders had carved a line through the gorge, cutting into the mountainsides, blasting tunnels through solid rock. In doing so, they had exposed layers of human history that had been buried for centuries. The structures found at the tunnel site in 1893 were not isolated remains, they were part of a larger settlement, a city or town that had been swept away by a catastrophic flood, a flood that had wiped out an entire civilization. The railway builders had uncovered a library of the past, a lost chapter of history, and then, deliberately and systematically, they had tried to hide what they had found. The question was why. In June 1887, 6 months after the incident at the Sibby camp, Thomas Hunt had a visitor. The visitor was a thin, nervous man named Arthur Langley, a civil servant from the Foreign Department in Calcutta. Langley's purpose, Hunt later recorded, was to investigate the progress of the railway and ensure that it was in accordance with the policy of the government. But Hunt, who had become sensitive to the oddities of the project, noted something strange. Langley spent an inordinate amount of time examining the survey maps and asking questions about Grimshaw's work. He was particularly interested in the sites where Grimshaw had noted the presence of hidden stones. Langley asked to see Hunt's personal journals, the ones that Hunt, a meticulous man, had kept since the beginning of the project. Hunt obliged. And then, a few days later, the journals were gone. Hunt assumed they had been misfiled, lost in the chaos of the administrative office. But the archivists in Delhi, a century and a half later, found evidence that the journals had been deliberately removed from Hunt's office and sent to Calcutta. They were never seen again. Grimshaw's parcel, the structures at the tunnel site, the artifacts sent to London, Hunt's journals, all had been systematically removed from the record. The only question was the identity of the person or persons who had ordered their removal. The likely answer, the archivists concluded, was Arthur Langley. Langley's role in the Foreign Department remains unclear, but he appears to have been one of the only people in the British administration to have known about the true purpose of the mission to the Bolan Pass. And he, it seems, had decided that the secrets of the pass were not for public knowledge. It was a logical conclusion, and it was also largely unsatisfying. The archivists, after all, had found the evidence of the cover-up, but they had not found the evidence of what was being covered up. The symbols on the stone blocks had not been identified. The artifacts had not been located. The lost city had not been excavated. The mystery remained, complete and intact, staring back at them from the gaps in the historical record. In April 2023, a year after the initial discovery of the photographs, a researcher at the National Railway Museum in Delhi found a new document in a collection that had been mislabeled for decades. The document was a report written by a British Army doctor, William Smith, who had been stationed at Quetta in the early 1890s. Smith, it seemed, had been one of the few Europeans allowed access to the Bolan Pass during the construction of the railway. His report, written for his superiors in the Army Medical Department, contained a description of the structures that had been exposed by the tunnel excavations. "The buildings are of a style unknown in this region," Smith wrote. "The walls are constructed of large stone blocks, dressed with great precision, but showing no evidence of iron tools. The mortar used is of a type I have not seen elsewhere. It appears to be a mixture of lime and some other substance, perhaps of organic origin. The structures are clearly part of a larger settlement. The excavations have revealed at least a dozen rooms and the remains of what may be a public building, perhaps a temple or a meeting hall." It was the description of the public building that caught the researchers' attention. Smith wrote, "On the walls of the main hall are carved a series of inscriptions in a script that is unknown to me. The characters are unlike any I have seen in India, Persia, or Afghanistan. They are angular and precise, with none of the curvilinear shapes of the Arabic or Persian scripts. The carvings are deeply incised and show no sign of damage from the flood that appears to have destroyed the settlement. It is my belief that they are the written records of a people entirely lost to history." Smith's report was dated 1892. The same year, the railway was expanded and the tunnel where the structures were found was sealed. The official reason given for the sealing was that the tunnel was structurally unstable and needed to be reinforced. But Smith's report suggested that the sealing was done to protect the inscriptions from vandalism. The walls were covered with plaster, the carvings obscured, the evidence of the lost city buried once again. But Smith's report was not the only document to survive. The researcher also found a letter from Smith to his wife, written in 1893, in which he expressed his frustration at the government's refusal to allow a proper excavation of the site. "They call it a security matter," he wrote, "but I believe they are hiding something. The symbols on those walls are not merely inscriptions, they are a record of a civilization that existed before any of the known powers of this region came to power. What they are hiding, I do not know. But I intend to find out." William Smith's fate is unknown. He died in 1895, according to the records, of a sudden illness at his post in Quetta. His letters to his wife were returned to her in England, and they remained in her family's possession until 1962, when they were donated to the British Library in London. They sat in a box in the library's archives for 60 years, untouched and forgotten, until the researcher in Delhi found a reference to them and requested a copy. The letter was the first document to emerge that suggested a deliberate conspiracy to suppress the knowledge of the lost city. It was the first evidence, in other words, that the government of British India had not just mislaid the records of the Bolan Pass incident, it had actively sought to destroy them. The story that emerges from these fragments is unsettling. It is a story of a lost civilization, a civilization that existed in the Bolan Pass before the Persian Empire, before the Greeks, before the rise of Islam. It is a story of a city that was destroyed by a cataclysmic flood, a flood that the legends of the Baloch tribes remember but that the official histories of the region refuse to acknowledge. And it is a story of a deliberate cover-up, a conspiracy by the British colonial authorities to erase the evidence of this lost civilization from the historical record. But why? What could a lost civilization in Balochistan have to do with the British Empire? Why would the government of India go to such lengths to suppress the knowledge of its existence? The answers, such as they are, remain hidden in the gaps of the archive, in the documents that were never written or never survived. The archivists in Delhi, having traced the thread of this mystery as far as they could, are left with more questions than answers. They have the photographs, the research paper, the telegram, the footnotes, the fragments of letters, but they do not have the complete picture. The artifacts sent to London are still missing. The inscriptions described by Dr. Smith have never been deciphered. The lost city has never been excavated. The history of the Bolan Pass, in other words, remains a history written in gaps. In the summer of 2022, the National Railway Museum in Delhi put on an exhibition of the photographs discovered in its archives, the lost images of the Bolan Pass Railway. The exhibition was a modest affair, a small room with large black and white images of bridges and tunnels, of laborers and engineers, of a railway that had once connected India to Afghanistan. But the archivists who curated the exhibition knew they had only told a fraction of the story. The photographs were evidence of a lost railway, yes. But they were also evidence of something else, a lost civilization, a lost history, a lost chapter of human existence that had been deliberately and systematically erased from the record. The official explanation for the suppression of the artifacts and inscriptions is that the British were concerned about maintaining control of a strategically vital region. They did not want local tribes to be inspired by the discovery of a glorious ancient past, they did not want archaeological discoveries to disrupt the smooth operation of the railway, they did not want to draw attention to the fact that British rule in India was a recent imposition, and that far older powers had existed in the region long before the arrival of the British. All of this is plausible. All of it may even be true. But it does not entirely account for the scale of the cover-up. It does not explain why Edward Grimshaw was killed. It does not explain why Arthur Langley removed Hunt's journals. It does not explain why the artifacts sent to London were never recorded or displayed. There is something else at work in this story, something that the official records cannot explain, something that the fragments of evidence only hint at. The lost city, if it existed, was ancient beyond measure. The inscriptions on its walls predated the known history of the region by 1,000 years or more. It was a civilization that had been entirely forgotten, wiped from the historical record, leaving behind only fragments of legend and a few crumbs of archaeological evidence. The British, one of the most meticulous record-keeping empires in history, had stumbled on the evidence of this lost civilization and had chosen to bury it. Why? There is a final document in the archive, a small piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, tucked into the files of the Northwestern Railway. It is a note written by Thomas Hunt, the chief engineer of the Bolan Pass Railway, in 1888, the year before the line opened. Hunt had been deeply affected by Grimshaw's death and by the strange events that had followed. In the note, which is more personal than official, he reflects on the nature of the Bolan Pass itself. He writes, "The ancients who lived here understood something about this region that we do not. They knew why the pass was valuable, they knew why it was worth building a city in a place where a flood could destroy everything. They knew the secrets of the mountains. And they are dead. We are building a railway through the Bolan Pass, and we think we have conquered it. But we have not conquered it. We have merely made a road through it. The pass itself remains unconquered. It will always remain unconquered. There are forces in this place that we cannot control, that we do not even understand." Hunt's note is the closest thing to a confession that exists in the archive. It is the document of a man who, despite his rationalism, his engineering, his faith in progress, had sensed that the Bolan Pass was not just a piece of geography. It was a place of memory, of meaning, of significance that transcended the strategic concerns of the British Empire. It was a place where the past had not entirely disappeared. It was a place where the past could still be felt, a presence that the British, for all their power, could not extinguish. The note ends with a sentence that has been interpreted by the archivists as a foreboding or a resignation: "The railway is built. The future belongs to the railway. But the past will not be forgotten. It waits. It always waits." Hunt died in 1901, of a heart attack, at his home in Simla. His note, which he had sent to his wife, was returned to the archive after her death, in 1923. It was discovered by the archivists in 2022, in a box of miscellaneous papers that had been in the archive since the days of the Northwestern Railway. The note is the final piece of the puzzle, the one that completes the picture and also makes it impossible to resolve. The answer, in short, is that the Bolan Pass has a history that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. It is a place of deep meaning, a place where the past is not dead, and where the forces of history, nature, and memory combine in ways that are beyond our comprehension. In the summer of 2023, the National Railway Museum in Delhi announced that it was planning a comprehensive exhibition on the history of the Bolan Pass Railway, including the photographs, the research paper, the telegram, and other documents that had been uncovered in its archives. The exhibition is intended to tell the full story of the railway, from its construction to its legacy, and to shed light on the mystery of the lost city. But the exhibition will also acknowledge the gaps in the narrative, the unanswered questions, the mysteries that remain unresolved. The Bolan Pass incident is not a story with a definitive conclusion. It is a story that invites interpretation, that challenges assumptions, that forces us to think about the meaning of history, memory, and loss. In the end, the mystery of the Bolan Pass remains as deep and as impenetrable as the pass itself. The lost city, if it exists, remains buried under the rubble of centuries. The inscriptions, if they ever existed, have been plastered over and forgotten. The artifacts, if they were ever sent to London, have been lost to time. The history of the region, as written by the British, is a history of silences, silences about the ancient past, silences about the people who lived there, silences about the evidence that there was more to the Bolan Pass than a strategic railway line. But the silences are not complete. The photographs exist. The fragments of letters exist. The notes and the telegrams exist. The evidence of a conspiracy, a deliberate erasure of a lost chapter of history, is real. And the question that was asked by a murdered engineer, a frustrated doctor, a haunted railway builder, still echoes through the archives: what did the Bolan Pass hide? What secret was so important that an empire would go to such lengths to bury it? The answer, perhaps, is not a secret at all. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more disturbing. Perhaps the British, in their frantic effort to bury the past, were not trying to hide a specific discovery. Perhaps they were trying to hide a general truth, that the history of the region was far older and far more complex than they had ever imagined. The lost city, the forgotten civilization, the unknown script, they were not just a discovery. They were a challenge. They were a threat to the narrative of progress, of civilization, of empire. They were a reminder that the people of the Bolan Pass had a history, a culture, a civilization of their own, one that owed nothing to the empires that had conquered them, one that predated the British by centuries. The British, in other words, were not hiding a secret. They were hiding a truth. And that truth, once revealed, would have changed everything. The Bolan Pass incident is a story of a single place, a single time, a single set of events. But it is also a story about the nature of history itself, about the stories we tell, the stories we forget, and the stories we choose to bury. It is a story about the silence that surrounds the past, and the fragmentary evidence that, despite that silence, can still speak to us. The photographs in the Delhi archive are not just images of a railway. They are windows onto a lost world. They are invitations to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to think about the past in ways that we were not trained to do. They are reminders that history is not a closed book, it is an open wound, a mystery that we can never fully solve. On a late spring evening in 2023, the archivists at the National Railway Museum in Delhi gathered in the exhibition hall to view the photographs one last time before the exhibition opened to the public. The room was quiet, the images glowing softly under the lights. One photograph in particular caught their attention, an image of a tunnel, its entrance arched and solid, its interior dark and unknowable. The tunnel was labeled Mary Jane, 1894. The archivists knew, from their research, that this tunnel had been built by the Bolan Pass Railway. They also knew that it had been sealed in 1892, after the discovery of the structures and the inscriptions. They knew that the railway had been expanded, that the tunnel had been abandoned, that the evidence of the lost city had been buried behind its walls. But the photograph showed something else as well. In the foreground of the image, barely visible, there was a figure. A man. He was standing in front of the tunnel entrance, looking directly at the camera. The man was dressed in Afghan clothing, his face hidden in shadow. He was tall, thin, and holding a staff in his hand. The archivists had not noticed the figure before, they had been so focused on the tunnel itself that they had missed the human presence in the image. Now, they looked at the figure and wondered. Who was he? Had he been there when the photograph was taken, or had he been added later? Was he a laborer, an engineer, a traveler? Or was he something else entirely, a shadow from the past that had somehow found its way into the image? The archivists could not answer these questions. The figure in the photograph was a mystery, just one more mystery in a story full of mysteries. But it was also a reminder, the Bolan Pass was not just a landscape. It was a place of memory, of meaning, of significance that transcended any single narrative, any single empire, any single era. The figure was not the only mystery in the image. In the background, just visible beyond the tunnel entrance, there was a building. It was not the railway, it was something else, something older, something that did not belong to the 19th century. The building was made of large stone blocks, cut with precision, arranged in a pattern that was unknown in the architecture of the region. It was the ruin of a lost city, a fragment of a forgotten civilization, a piece of a history that had been deliberately erased. The archivists looked at the photograph for a long time. They looked at the figure, at the building, at the tunnel entrance. They looked at the dark interior of the tunnel, and they wondered what lay within. They wondered if, somewhere in the depths of the Bolan Pass, in the hidden chambers and buried rooms, there was still evidence of the lost city. They wondered if the inscriptions still existed, hidden behind the plaster, waiting to be found. They wondered if the artifacts sent to London had survived, sitting in a forgotten box in a dusty museum. They wondered if, one day, the secrets of the Bolan Pass would be revealed. But they also knew that some secrets remain hidden. The Bolan Pass, after all, was not just a place, it was a symbol of the hidden past, the buried history, the forgotten stories that lie beneath the surface of our own world. It was a reminder that the past is never truly lost, but simply waiting for us to discover it. And it was a question, are we ready to face what we might find? The exhibition at the National Railway Museum in Delhi opened to the public in July 2023. It was a modest exhibition, but it attracted attention. Visitors came to see the photographs, to learn about the lost railway, to marvel at the engineering achievement that had built a line through the Bolan Pass. But they also came to hear the story of the lost city, the forgotten civilization, the mystery of the hidden stones. They came to be haunted by the images of a place where the past had not been forgotten, where the forces of history and memory still lived. The exhibition ended in October 2023. The photographs were returned to the archives, the documents were filed away, the story of the Bolan Pass incident was once again buried in the depths of the archive. But the questions remained. And they will always remain. Because the Bolan Pass is still there. The railway is still there. The hidden stones are still there, somewhere in the depths of the gorge, waiting to be found. The mystery, in other words, is not over. It is waiting. It always waits.